Sometimes keeping up with all this global trade stuff feels like trying to follow a recipe where they keep changing the ingredients halfway through.
That's a relatable feeling. And today, our sources give us a good look at some of the key changes happening right now, like a snapshot.
Exactly. We've got the latest on Trump's tariffs, what's going on with the U.S.-China trade talks. Always a big one.
Always. And what might happen if China's economy, hits a speed bump.
Right. And this fascinating look into why Chinese diplomatic language can sometimes feel, well, a bit hard to pin down. Like you need a decoder ring.
Huh. Yeah, it's about understanding the different layers, the motivations behind the words. So where should we start peeling back those layers today? Welcome back. I'm Joe.
Hey, everyone. Sunny here. Let's dive right into these tariffs, because that's been a constant topic, hasn't it? Seems the U.S. and China had a sit-down in Switzerland recently.
Yes, the first round of talks just wrapped up, and the key takeaway seems to be that both sides kind of agreed the current tariffs are just too high, they need to come down. Oh, okay. Well, that in itself sounds like progress, right? Because, honestly, who hasn't felt the pinch from some of these?
Definitely a shift. And China's Vice Premier He Lifeng used phrases like substantial progress and important consensus. Sounds pretty positive.
Yeah, substantial progress sounds like they actually got somewhere, not just, had coffee.
It does suggest a move forward. Plus, they're talking about setting up a regular U.S.-China economic and trade consultation mechanism. That's important, too.
Okay, so like a permanent chat line.
Sort of, yeah. A more organized way to handle these things instead of just reacting. But we also heard from China's Vice Minister of Commerce, Li Chenggang.
And what did he say? Same vibe.
Well, he added the reminder that any agreement has to actually work for China's own development goals and, benefit both sides. So there are still clear boundaries being drawn.
Right. Makes sense. It's not just about cutting tariffs for the sake of it. It's got to work practically.
Yeah.
How was the mood, did they say?
The Chinese side described it as frank, in-depth, and constructive, which, is probably diplomat speak for we talked seriously, maybe didn't agree on everything, but nobody stormed out.
Okay, fair enough. Constructive is good.
And they emphasize things like mutual respect, equality, mutual benefit, professionalism. The principles China really wants front and center.
Okay, now here's where my ears perked up. There's buzz about some potentially big tariff cuts, like U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods maybe dropping from 145% to 50%. And China going from 125% to 45%, those numbers are huge.
They are definitely significant figures if they pan out. It's still speculation at this point, but the fact that numbers that large are even being whispered about suggests a real desire to dial down the tension.
Yeah, you don't float numbers like that just for fun.
And here's something interesting. Apparently, the number of Chinese cargo ships waiting off the U.S. West Coast dropped dramatically from 41 to 0 in just 6 days.
Whoa, hold on. 0. That's wild. What does that mean?
It strongly hints that businesses might be anticipating some kind of tariff reduction, like maybe holding back shipments until things change. It's a pretty telling indicator.
Okay, that's a fascinating piece of the puzzle. But the sources also say, don't expect a giant, all-encompassing deal just yet.
Exactly. A massive deal is probably unlikely right now, but even modest progress is seen as positive. And there was even a mention of a possible Trump-Xi meeting down the line.
Okay. So maybe small steps, potentially leading to bigger things.
That seems to be the hope. A meeting between the leaders could certainly add momentum. We'll really need to watch for that joint statement, expected around May 12th, 2025, to see what was actually agreed upon.
Gotcha. May 12th.
Yeah.
Mark the calendar. Now, shifting gears just a bit. The U.S. isn't only talking to China, right? There's this new agreement with the U.K.
That's right. And what's interesting there is this idea of a 10% tariff emerging as potentially a new benchmark, sort of a new normal for accessing the U.S. market.
A 10% entry fee, basically, for anyone.
It seems to be becoming a consistent baseline in recent U.S. policy, yes. The U.S.-UK deal gives us a concrete example, especially with cars.
Right, the car quota. What was it, 100,000 vehicles?
Yeah, an annual quota of 100,000 vehicles from the UK under Section 232. Within that quota, it's a 10% tariff. More than that, higher tariffs kick in.
Okay, but how many cars does the UK actually send us?
That's the key point. Last year, it was only about 102,000. So most of their car exports will likely fall within that quota and get the lower 10% rate.
Huh. So it sounds as maybe the UK got a pretty decent deal out of this, potentially better than some others.
The analysis suggests their terms might be more favorable, yes, compared to, say, some East Asian countries. And there's also a new steel and aluminum alliance.
Yeah. What's that about?
Basically, UK steel and aluminum get 0% tariffs within certain quotas. The trade-off is the UK cooperates on tackling trade barriers in markets outside the US.
Ah, okay. So it's a bit of give and take. Help us out elsewhere, we'll help you here.
Pretty much. And there's a fascinating detail about the overall US-UK trade balance. A lot of the US trade surplus with the UK is actually due to gold exports moving through London, which doesn't necessarily mean UK consumers are buying all that gold, you know.
It's just passing through.
Exactly. So if you filter out the gold, the UK might actually run a trade surplus with the US in goods and services. That unique situation likely helped them negotiate these terms.
That's really interesting. So even with this seemingly moderate 10% tariff, Trump's overall goals are still in play. Reducing deficits, boosting U.S. manufacturing.
Yes, those aims seem consistent. And the sources also connect these policies to the goal of curbing illegal immigration, suggesting a multi-pronged approach.
Wow, okay. Lots going on there.
And even if 10% doesn't sound crippling right now, the long-term pressure could still force companies to really rethink their supply chains over time.
And some analysts think these kinds of policies might stick around, even if the administration changes.
That's the suggestion, yeah. That this might represent a longer-term shift in U.S. trade thinking, underscoring their potential impact regardless of who's in charge. It's all happening fast, lots of noise, but the underlying direction, maybe not totally off base, according to some sources, just needs time.
The argument is that while the actions are frequent and often controversial, the strategic direction might have some logic, but the full effects could take years to become clear.
Okay, here's a curveball, though. Apparently, something like $300 billion has flowed out of the U.S. in just 3 months. What's that about? Investors getting spooked by trade stuff? Or maybe just cashing out of tech stocks?
That's a significant outflow. It could be a combination of factors, really. Uncertainty over trade, maybe investors thinking U.S. markets are a bit overvalued, taking profits, or just seeing better opportunities elsewhere.
Elsewhere, like Europe.
It seems so. European stock markets have definitely seen a boost. The German DAX index hit a record high, significantly outpacing the broader European index. Suggests some of that capital found a new home across the Atlantic. Some money's moving around based on all this. The tariff story is clearly still developing. Let's pivot to China's economy itself. Sources say it's kind of narrowing, and all this bond issuing might actually slow things down internally.
Yeah, the research indicates potential headwinds. Growth forecasts for 2025 are being revised downwards, maybe into the 3% to 4.5% range. That's slower than they'd like.
And what are the main drags?
Key concerns are weak investment and consumer spending. People just aren't spending or investing as confidently. And then there's the massive debt issue.
Oh, right. The debt. How bad is it?
Total debt reached 335% of their GDP back in 2020. That's a lot. And local governments are under pressure to restructure something like 10 trillion yuan of debt. That's a huge anchor.
Yikes. And if China's economy slows, that affects everyone, right? Globally.
Absolutely. It could mean reduced global trade demand overall, fewer buyers for everyone's stuff. Plus, you have China pushing hard in high-tech exports like electric vehicles.
Yeah, the EVs.
Yeah.
Big competition there.
Definitely a challenge for Western automakers and industries. And don't forget, China holds about $1.7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds.
1.7 trillion. So if their economy wobbles, that could send ripples through financial markets everywhere.
Precisely. Financial stability is vulnerable to those kinds of shifts. They hold a lot of U.S. debt, so their actions matter globally. It's this tension. They need short-term stimulus, but the real fix requires long-term structural reforms.
And on top of all that, there's the whole geopolitical tension cooker. Potential U.S. tariffs of, 60% being talked about.
That's another layer of uncertainty, yes. Those kinds of tariffs, if implemented, could really escalate things.
The sources mentioned their growth actually slowed quite a bit in 2024 already, like 2.4 to 2.8%.
Yes, and the concern is that the projected recovery in 2025 might be more cyclical, just a temporary bounce, rather than fixing the underlying structural issues. The real estate crisis hasn't helped either.
Yeah, that's hit consumer confidence, hasn't it, and wages.
It has. Lowered confidence, slowed wage growth. Private investment has also weakened because credit got tighter, and local governments are feeling the fiscal pressure from all that debt.
Are they trying to stimulate the economy?
They are. Tax revenue actually decreased in 2024, which limits options, but they plan to increase the central government's deficit target for 2025 and issue about 3 trillion yuan in special national bonds. But it's a tough balancing act.
So this risk of a new normal, low growth, low inflation, That's a real long-term possibility if they don't sort out these structural problems.
It's a significant long-term risk, yeah. It could impact social stability and make it harder to achieve their big national goals, like technological self-reliance.
So summing up the China economy part, slower growth could mean less trade globally, but they're still pushing hard in tech, creating competitive pressure. It's complex.
Very complex. Really shows how intertwined everything is. Domestic policy, global trade, technological competition.
Okay, now for something a bit different, but you mentioned it earlier, the way Chinese officials talk. Why does it sometimes feel like they're not getting to the point? Lots of big statements, but light on specifics.
Ah, yes, the decoder ring problem. It's a mix of things. Communication style, strategy, culture, even history. One big factor is what analysts call programmatic language.
Programmatic language, what's that?
Think of it as using standardized phrases, official slogans, grand concepts like the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence or community of shared future for mankind. They use these a lot.
Okay, I've heard those.
Right. The goal is to project consistency, authority. But to outsiders, it can sound abstract, repetitive, and, well, like they're avoiding specifics. Phrases like China's position is consistent or resolutely opposes state a stance but don't give you much detail.
Yeah, it's like reading the policy title but not the actual policy.
Kind of. Another element is avoiding direct conflict. This ties into traditional Chinese culture, influenced by Confucianism, the idea that harmony is precious.
So be indirect, don't cause waves.
Exactly. It can lead to more circumlocutory speech, talking around an issue. The key points might be buried in a lot of rhetoric, which creates that perception of lacking focus.
And they're also talking to their own people back home, right?
Absolutely. Official statements are also for domestic consumption, for propaganda. They need to sound confident, aligned with the party line, emphasize Chinese strength, maybe prioritize emotional appeal over just cold, hard facts for an international audience.
Okay, that makes sense. Multiple audiences. And then there's deliberate ambiguity, like not being specific on purpose.
Yes, strategic ambiguity. It's a tactic. In sensitive negotiations or on tricky issues, being vague keeps their options open, gives them room to maneuver, and prevents others from exploiting a specific commitment.
Like in the trade talks, maybe, emphasizing principles like equality, but not locking into details yet.
Precisely that. Plus, there's the internal process. Spokespeople usually stick very strictly to centrally approved talking points. Statements go through layers of view.
So it ends up sounding kind of rigid, not spontaneous.
Exactly. It removes personal flair or off-the-cuff remarks, leading to that very formal, sometimes impersonal tone.
And history plays a role, too, like past grievances.
Definitely. China's modern history, the period they often refer to as the century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, unequal treaties shapes how they talk today. Emphasizing independence, autonomy, non-interference is partly a reaction to that history.
So they focus on principles, maybe sometimes over practical solutions.
It can lead to that, yes, a focus on asserting those principled stances. And finally, there's the cultural difference in collectivism versus individualism.
How does that fit in?
Well, in a collectivist culture, the emphasis is on the group, the nation. So official statements represent the national position, not necessarily one person's clear, focused argument, which might differ from the more direct, individual-focused style often expected in Western media.
Wow. Okay, so culture, strategy, history, internal politics. It all feeds into why the language sounds the way it does. Now, related to that, why the difference in emphasis? Why stress, equality, peace, respect, so much with powerful countries, but maybe less so with smaller ones?
That's a really sharp observation, and it gets right into geopolitics and power dynamics. When dealing with powerful nations, the US, the EU, the rhetoric of equality and respect is often used strategically.
Oh, so?
It's partly to offset the other side's perceived power advantage, to demand equal negotiating space, to project an image, both internationally and domestically, that China isn't being pushed around or seen as weak. Repeating equal consultation or win-win cooperation reinforces this.
Okay, so it's a way to level the playing field, rhetorically at least. And peace.
Emphasizing peace aims to reduce potential hostility or fear from powerful nations, especially when competition is high. China wants to be seen as a responsible major power, not a threat. It's soft power language.
Makes sense. But with smaller nations, the tone changes.
Often, yes. Towards weaker nations, particularly in Africa or Southeast Asia, China might adopt more of a great power stance. The language might focus more on aid, investment, common development, with less explicit talk about equality.
Why the difference?
It reflects a more realist diplomatic approach, the implicit idea that the stronger party leads. In initiatives like the Belt and Road, China often positions itself as a benefactor, highlighting its contributions more than a strictly equal partnership.
So more hierarchy involved.
Potentially. Also, weaker nations often depend more on China economically or politically, so China feels less need to constantly emphasize equality because the power dynamic is already clear. They have more leverage.
It sounds a bit like, well, realpolitik in action.
It has strong elements of that. History plays in here too. That memory of past humiliation by Western powers makes China extra sensitive about equality when dealing with them.
So it's a reaction to history when talking to the West.
Partly, yes, and it plays well domestically satisfies nationalism. But towards weaker nations, there's sometimes this benefactor mentality, stemming from China's view of itself as a leader of the developing world. Providing aid is seen almost as a duty.
So less focus on equal footing, more on China's leading role.
In some contexts, yes, like promoting South-South cooperation. And sometimes there's an element of wanting to promote their own development model to these countries, which again lends itself to projecting strength rather than equal dialogue.
And resource allocation. Does that affect the language?
It does. Negotiating with powerful nations is high stakes, big trade deals, tech access. It requires careful language, significant diplomatic effort. Equality and peace are tools to manage those complex, potentially conflict-ridden relationships.
Whereas with weaker nations,
often the relationship is more about economic influence, securing resources, building infrastructure via Belt and Road. China uses its economic weight. In that context, emphasizing equality might seem less relevant or could even dilute their dominant position.
And again, the domestic audience matters for both sides of this coin.
Absolutely. Talking equality with the U.S. shows the domestic audience that China stands tall, isn't afraid of power. Talking about aid and cooperation with weaker nations shows great power responsibility and reinforces the narrative of China's rise. Both serve internal propaganda needs.
It's all incredibly strategic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even down to the specific words used.
Very much so. You could even argue cultural psychology plays a role. Traditional ideas about hierarchy might subtly influence things. And the concept of face, maintaining national dignity, is crucial in both contexts, just expressed differently.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground today. We looked at the latest twists in the Trump tariff saga, the ongoing U.S.-China dance.
Especially considering the pressures on China's economy.
Right. And then we dove into the nuances of Chinese diplomatic language, why it can seem indirect, and why that emphasis on equality and peace seems to shift depending on who they're talking to. It's all so interconnected.
It truly is. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Considering these complex economic ties, these careful diplomatic strategies, how might these subtle shifts in language we've discussed actually foreshadow bigger changes? You know, in global relations, in trade patterns, in the years ahead. That
is definitely something to chew on. Heavy stuff. Well, if you want to keep chewing on these fascinating topics with us, make sure you subscribe to The Deep Dive. And hey, definitely go check out our old friend Micky's YouTube channel. He got some great deep dives too. We're always promoting.
We are. The learning never stops, right?
It's absolutely right. Until next time.